November 14th, 1965. Landing Zone X-Ray, Ia Drang Valley, Central Highlands of South Vietnam. 10:48 in the morning. First Lieutenant James Riley's pen trembled in his hand as he scrawled into his field notebook, still shaken from the sudden firefight that had erupted just after the helicopters touched down and pulled away. The rifle in my hands saved me, he thought. Yet 3 of my comrades didn't make it because theirs failed to fire. Among the thick elephant grass and the dense triple-layered jungle, roughly 14 miles west of Pleiku, soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile, had engaged for the first time in a major clash with regular North Vietnamese Army forces. 450 men from Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, had been inserted by helicopter into a clearing at the base of the Chupong Massif. Within minutes, they encountered elements of the NVA's 66th Regiment. What would unfold over the next 3 days was a battle that would test men, machines, and the very trust soldiers placed in their weapons. The M16 rifle rushed into production and shipped to Vietnam with promises of unmatched firepower had proven flawless for some units and disastrous for others. None of the men on the ground realized that this was only the beginning of a catastrophic failure, one that would erode confidence in the rifle and cost hundreds of lives before congressional hearings forced urgent reforms. The tragedy was measured not in troop movements or tactical plans, but in jammed mechanisms, powdered propellants, and chrome plating decisions that prioritized cost and speed over soldier survival. This crisis did not originate in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It began in the offices of the Pentagon and the factories of America's defense industry. The rifle that would become the M16 had its origins in the late 1950s as the Armalite AR-15, designed by Eugene Stoner. Born in 1922, Stoner had served in the Marines during World War II and later honed his skills as a machinist and engineer. His approach to rifle design was revolutionary, challenging decades of military orthodoxy. The AR-15 was first publicly demonstrated at Fort Benning, Georgia, in May 1957. It was light, weighing just over 6 pounds compared to the M14's 9, and it fired a high-velocity 5.56 millimeter round. The cartridge, based on the commercial .223 Remington round, propelled a 55-grain bullet at more than 3,000 feet per second. Early tests with Special Forces in 1962 showed exceptional results. Low recoil allowed accurate automatic fire, and the high ammunition capacity let a soldier carry 300 rounds at roughly the same weight as 180 rounds of 7.62 millimeters for the M14. The high-speed, small-caliber bullet caused devastating wounding effects in close-quarters jungle combat. Air Force security police units adopted the rifle enthusiastically, reporting excellent results. Yet between these early trials and full-scale deployment lay a chain of decisions that would turn a brilliant weapon into a deadly liability. In January 1963, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara concluded the AR-15 outperformed the M14 and ordered an end to M14 production. By November, he authorized the procurement of 85,000 XM16E1 rifles, despite objections from Army leaders loyal to the heavier, battle-tested M14. Production began in March 1964. McNamara's decision was influenced by cost, urgency for a rifle suited to Vietnam's jungle terrain, and his confidence in modern systems analysis over traditional military judgment. But the rifles sent to soldiers were not the same as the ones that had excelled in early testing. The first major change came in ammunition. Stoner had designed the AR-15 to fire cartridges loaded with IMR 4475, a stick powder from DuPont. This powder produced precise pressures and a cyclic rate of fire around 800 rounds per minute, tailored for the rifle's direct gas impingement system, where propellant gases are directed straight into the bolt carrier to cycle the action. In March 1964, DuPont informed the Army it could not mass-produce IMR 4475 to the required standards in the timeline demanded. The stick powder worked perfectly in small batches, maintaining consistent velocity and pressure, but scaling to millions of rounds while keeping uniformity proved impossible. Production of extruded powder required meticulous control of temperature, humidity, and cutting. Even slight variations could alter chamber pressures. The Army needed millions of rounds quickly for Vietnam, and DuPont could not deliver. Olin Madison offered an alternative, WC-846, a ball powder already used for 7.62 mm NATO cartridges. The manufacturing process was entirely different. Nitrocellulose was dissolved, formed into tiny spheres, and hardened, a process far faster, easier to scale, and more consistent than IMR 4475. A batch could be produced in 40 hours instead of 2 weeks, and Olin Madison could supply the quantities the Army demanded. The Army and Olin Madison knew WC-846 burned differently. It created higher peak pressures that persisted longer as the bullet traveled down the barrel. The gas pressure at the gas port rose, causing the bolt carrier to cycle more violently and increasing the cyclic rate from roughly 800 to 850 to 1,000 rounds per minute. More critically, the powder contained calcium carbonate, which acted as a stabilizer but left heavy fouling behind. In conventional piston-operated rifles, this residue could be cleaned externally. The M16's direct gas impingement meant every bit of debris was blown directly into the bolt, carrier, and chamber with each shot. No extensive testing was conducted with the new powder. The rifle had passed trials with IMR 4475, and the substitution was treated as a minor adjustment rather than a major system change. Acceptance tests continued with remaining IMR 4475 rounds, even as millions of WC-846 cartridges were shipped to Vietnam. The second critical decision involved chrome plating. Stoner and his engineers strongly recommended plating the chamber and bore. Chrome plating was not cosmetic, it was essential for survival. Chrome resisted corrosion, reduced pitting, and ensured reliable extraction in humid, wet conditions. Southeast Asia's jungle was unforgiving. Moisture condensed in chambers overnight, powder residue mixed with humidity, and steel rusted quickly. Chrome allowed chambers to shed fouling. Unplated chambers trapped it. Air Force AR-15s in 1962 had been chrome-plated, but the Army removed the plating to save roughly $1.25 per rifle and speed production. Tests conducted in clean, controlled environments suggested extraction failures would be minimal, but Vietnam would not resemble a test lab. When WC-846 rounds arrived in theater in 1965, the results were immediate and deadly. Fouling built up rapidly, chambers overheated, and spent brass expanded against rough, unplated steel. Extractors tore through cartridge rims. Bolts cycled backward without ejecting cases, leaving spent shells stuck in the chamber. The rifles became effectively single-shot weapons. Clearing a jam required inserting a cleaning rod down the barrel and striking it to dislodge the casing, an impossible task in the midst of combat. Soldiers improvised with bayonets, tent stakes, anything rigid enough. Many never succeeded. Reports from late 1965 were alarming. Rifles jammed after only a few magazines. Letters described weapons that froze solid. One soldier was found dead, his rifle open, cleaning rod beside him, a casing still lodged in the chamber. Soldiers were told their rifles were self-cleaning, but the reality was far harsher. The combination of fouling, heat, rough chambers, and increased cyclic rates created a perfect storm for failure. At landing zone X-ray, most rifles. This was not an untested or experimental technology. Chrome plating had been applied to artillery barrels since World War I and to aircraft machine guns throughout World War II. The process involved electroplating a thin layer of chromium onto steel surfaces, creating a hard, corrosion-resistant finish. Chrome plating offered protection against the humid, jungle conditions of Vietnam and helped prevent spent cartridge cases from sticking in the chamber during extraction. The United States military already had extensive experience with tropical corrosion from the Pacific theater of World War II. Weapons that functioned flawlessly in temperate climates often deteriorated rapidly under the heat and humidity of the Pacific Islands. Decades earlier, chrome plating had been identified as a reliable solution, yet the Army rejected the recommendation. Chrome plating added both cost and time to production. Each chamber had to be meticulously prepared, plated in an electroplating bath, and inspected afterward. The process introduced additional steps and extended the manufacturing timeline. Beyond that, some traditionalists in Army ordnance worried that plating would degrade accuracy. Among civilian target shooters, a belief persisted that chrome-plated barrels were less precise than bare steel, even though no testing had confirmed this for military-grade standards. Despite warnings from the rifle's manufacturer, the Army elected to produce rifles without chrome-plated chambers, citing cost concerns, though no official documentation clearly specifies the exact savings per weapon. Army ordnance believed that proper cleaning and maintenance would prevent corrosion problems. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong in the unforgiving jungle environment of Vietnam. Another critical decision compounded the emerging crisis. Colt had marketed the M16 as requiring minimal maintenance, far less than the M14. This claim was technically true when firing ammunition loaded with IMR 4475 under controlled conditions. Early briefings and promotional material described the rifle as nearly self-cleaning. The Army took this characterization at face value and failed to provide soldiers with adequate cleaning kits or proper maintenance instruction before deployment. Troops often received M16s with virtually no cleaning supplies, minimal guidance on proper maintenance, and in some cases explicit statements warning that improper cleaning could damage the rifle. Many soldiers were told the rifle was self-cleaning, advice that proved deadly when combined with WC-846 powder fouling and unplated chambers. A fourth modification made the situation worse. The original AR-15 design lacked a forward assist, a mechanism that allows a soldier to manually push the bolt fully into battery if it fails to close automatically. Stoner had deliberately omitted this feature, reasoning that if the bolt would not close easily, a malfunction existed, and the soldier should clear it rather than forcing it. Army ordnance insisted on adding the forward assist, claiming soldiers needed the ability to push the rifle into battery under combat conditions. This seemingly minor alteration would later exemplify systemic failures. Soldiers attempting to force bolts closed in chambers already fouled beyond function. The first M16s reached Vietnam in early 1965, initially issued to elite units, special forces, airborne, and the 1st Cavalry Division. These early deployments largely used remaining IMR 4475 ammunition and soldiers who had received comprehensive training and maintained their weapons carefully. Reports from these units were mostly positive. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, carried M16s into the Ai Drang Valley in November 1965. Moore, a West Point graduate and Korean War veteran, commanded 450 men organized into 4 rifle companies. They deployed aboard 16 UH-1D Huey helicopters, landing in waves at Landing Zone X-Ray, a clearing roughly 100 yards wide at the eastern base of Chu Pong Massif, a mountain rising to 4,400 feet, marking the border with Cambodia. Within 15 minutes of the first helicopter touching down, Moore's men encountered North Vietnamese forces. What followed was a desperate 3-day engagement against elements of 3 North Vietnamese regiments, possibly 2,000 soldiers in total. Fighting often occurred at point-blank range, sometimes escalating to hand-to-hand combat. The North Vietnamese launched human wave assaults. American soldiers fired their M16s on full automatic, cycling through magazine after magazine. In this first major clash between American forces and regular North Vietnamese units, the rifle performed exceptionally well for most soldiers. Its high rate of fire and lightweight ammunition allowed troops to carry far more rounds than would have been possible with M14s. Moore had instructed his men to carry as much ammunition as possible. Many soldiers bore 300 to 400 rounds each. In the intense close-quarters fighting at Ai Drang, this ammunition capacity proved decisive. Combined with artillery support and tactical airstrikes, the American firepower prevented the North Vietnamese from overrunning the landing zone. Sergeant Ernie Savage, who fought at LZ X-Ray, later recalled, "I didn't run out of ammo. I had about 30 magazines in my pack, and the M16 never failed me." Savage's platoon held a critical sector of the perimeter throughout the battle. For them, the rifles functioned as intended. But Ai Drang represented the ideal case for the M16. Soldiers were well trained, part of an elite air mobile division, and maintained their weapons meticulously. Many rifles still used IMR 4475 powder, the original propellant the rifle had been designed for. Weapons were new, with uncorroded chambers, and battle chaos masked early warning signs of the problems that would soon emerge. By 1966, hundreds of thousands of M16s flooded into Vietnam, loaded exclusively with WC-846 powder, and distributed to conventional infantry units receiving minimal training. The crisis began to unfold. By mid-year, reports from the field documented catastrophic failure rates. Soldiers wrote desperate letters home, describing rifles that jammed after only a few rounds. Officers filed formal complaints, noting that troops had lost confidence in their primary weapon. Medical evacuation helicopters brought back wounded soldiers who reported that their rifles had failed at critical moments, leaving them defenseless in combat.
The malfunctions followed a pattern that soon became both predictable and lethal. After firing 10 to 20 rounds, especially when soldiers used full automatic fire, the rifle would fail to extract the fired cartridge. Across Vietnam, troops began to recognize the sequence almost instinctively. A soldier squeezed the trigger. The rifle discharged. Gas pressure drove the bolt carrier rearward. The extractor claw bit into the rim of the spent brass casing and attempted to pull it free. But the cartridge case did not move. It remained locked in place, seized by corrosion along the chamber walls and cemented by layers of powder residue. The extractor, a small hook of hardened spring steel, continued pulling. The brass case, softer than the steel claw, began to deform. Under stress, the rim tore away completely. The extractor snapped backward, carrying only the torn rim, while the body of the cartridge remained jammed tightly in the chamber. The bolt carrier continued its rearward motion, ejecting the useless scrap of brass. On its forward stroke, the bolt stripped a fresh round from the magazine and attempted to chamber it, but the bolt could not close. The chamber was already occupied. The fresh round rammed into the stuck casing, wedging the entire mechanism solid. When the soldier pulled the trigger again, nothing happened. The hammer fell, but the firing pin could not reach the primer because the bolt was out of battery. The rifle was now completely disabled. Pulling the charging handle accomplished nothing. Striking the forward assist only forced the jam tighter. The weapon had become dead weight. There was only one way to clear such a malfunction. The magazine had to be removed, the bolt locked to the rear, a cleaning rod inserted from the muzzle and driven forcefully down the barrel to knock the stuck casing backward and out through the ejection port. It was a slow, awkward procedure, even under ideal conditions, but soldiers had not been issued cleaning rods. The rifle had been promoted as requiring little maintenance. Cleaning kits, when they existed at all, were usually kept back at base camps rather than carried on patrol. Even if a soldier had a rod, performing this clearance under fire was nearly impossible. It required both hands, complete focus, and at least half a minute of uninterrupted time. In jungle combat, where the enemy could be 10 feet away, 30 seconds without a functioning weapon meant death. Letters home captured the desperation. In June 1966, Marine Corporal John Stevens wrote, "Out of 40 rounds, my rifle jammed about 10 times. I carry as many grenades as I can, plus bayonet and K-bar jungle knife, so I'll have something to fight with. If you can, please send me a bore rod and a 1 1/4 inch paintbrush. I need it. These rifles are getting a lot of guys killed because they jam so easily." Such letters reflected every infantryman's nightmare, fighting in dense jungle where contact erupted without warning, where survival depended on instant firepower, only to discover that your rifle would fire a handful of rounds and then become a useless club. By October 1966, the crisis had reached the level of formal reports. The commanding officer of 1st Battalion 2nd Infantry, 1st Infantry Division, submitted an official complaint stating that malfunctions with the new M16E1 rifles were so frequent that soldier confidence had collapsed. His unit had suffered casualties in firefights where weapons failed at the moment they were needed most. Troops began scavenging AK-47 rifles from fallen North Vietnamese soldiers, weapons they trusted to function no matter the conditions. The AK-47 became the M16's damning comparison. Designed in the Soviet Union by Mikhail Kalashnikov and adopted in 1947, the AK used an entirely different operating system. Instead of directing gas into the bolt carrier, the AK employed a long-stroke gas piston. When fired, gas was tapped from the barrel and drove a piston backward, physically separate from the bolt carrier. The piston transferred its energy mechanically, then returned forward while the bolt carrier continued cycling. Combustion gases and fouling never entered the action. Residue remained confined to the gas tube and piston assembly. The rifle was also built with generous tolerances. There was space inside the receiver for dirt, sand, and debris to move and fall away. The bolt could cycle even when fouled. The curved magazine fed reliably even when dented or filthy. Every aspect of the design favored reliability over refinement. Kalashnikov, a former Soviet tank commander wounded in World War II, understood that soldiers in combat could not maintain weapons carefully.
He designed a rifle that would work regardless of neglect. North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong fighters treated their AKs brutally. Rifles were cached underground for months, soaked in water, buried in mud, carried through rivers, dropped into rice paddies, and exposed constantly to heat and humidity. Maintenance was minimal or non-existent, yet the rifles continued to fire. An AK could be pulled from a muddy stream, the bolt cycled once to clear water, and it would fire. American soldiers noticed the contrast immediately. Sergeant William Rodriguez later wrote, "We found rifles that had been buried in mud, dropped in rivers, and left in the jungle for weeks. We picked them up, pulled the bolt back, and they fired. Our M16s jammed if you looked at them wrong." In infantry units, the comparison became a bitter joke. The enemy had better rifles. An underground trade in captured AK-47s quickly emerged. Officially, carrying enemy weapons was forbidden. American ammunition was incompatible, and there was a risk of friendly fire if soldiers were mistaken for the enemy. Unofficially, many squad leaders allowed or quietly encouraged the practice. Some soldiers carried both weapons, using the M16 until it jammed and then switching to the AK. A working rifle, regardless of origin, was better than a useless one. Senior commanders were slow to acknowledge the scale of the problem. Reports eventually reached General William Westmoreland, commander of Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. Westmoreland faced an impossible dilemma. He had personally requested over 100,000 M16s, praising them as ideal for jungle warfare. He had visited units after the Battle of Ia Drang and heard favorable accounts of their performance. He believed the rifle represented a major improvement over the M14, yet soldiers under his command were writing home that the weapon was failing them in combat. Acknowledging the crisis meant admitting one of the largest procurement failures in modern military history. In December 1966, the Marine Corps initiated a formal investigation, surveying 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines after a series of engagements in which rifle malfunctions had directly contributed to casualties. By then, the pattern was undeniable. The problem was not training, it was not soldier negligence, it was a system that had failed its men at the most fundamental level by giving them a weapon they could not trust when their lives depended on it.
The battalion had been operating as part of Operation Prairie, fighting intense engagements in the demilitarized zone near the North Vietnamese border. When the survey results were compiled, they were staggering. Nearly 80% of the Marines questioned reported weapon stoppages during combat. Many said their rifles jammed after firing fewer than 10 rounds. Several Marines stated they had been wounded or had watched fellow Marines die because their rifles failed during enemy contact. Some reported catastrophic failures after firing only 3 or 4 shots. The survey carefully cataloged the malfunctions. By an overwhelming margin, failures to extract spent cartridge cases were the most common, accounting for roughly 80% of all stoppages. Failures to feed, in which a fresh round failed to chamber correctly, made up most of the remainder. Failures to fire, where the firing pin struck but did not ignite the primer, were comparatively rare. The extraction failures followed a sequence that had become tragically familiar. After a brief burst of fire, a cartridge case would seize inside the chamber. The extractor claw would tear through the rim, leaving the body of the casing wedged tightly in place. The rifle would lock solid, completely unusable. Among the most damning evidence uncovered was a story later confirmed during the ICORD Committee investigation. A Marine corporal had been killed while running back and forth along his squad's fighting positions, attempting to clear jammed rifles using a cleaning rod.
He was the only Marine in the squad who had managed to acquire one, apparently by trading with another unit. During a firefight, multiple rifles in the squad suffered extraction failures almost simultaneously. The corporal moved from position to position, driving stuck cases out of chambers while exposed to enemy fire. He was shot and killed while clearing a jam from another Marine's weapon. His own rifle, which had been functioning properly, was found beside his body. He had died trying to keep his squad fighting. By early 1967, these accounts were no longer confined to after-action reports and private letters. Stories of rifle failures began reaching the American public. Soldiers' letters home appeared in newspapers across the country. One Marine officer wrote directly to Senator Gaylord Nelson, stating, "The weapon has failed us at crucial moments. As many as 60% of the rifles failed to operate. I know of at least 2 Marines who died within 10 feet of the enemy with jammed rifles." Another Marine wrote bluntly, "Do you know what killed most of us? Our own rifles, the M16. Families who had lost sons in Vietnam began asking an unavoidable question: had inadequate equipment played a role in their deaths? On March 26, 1967, the Washington Daily News published a major exposé detailing reliability problems with the M16, featuring interviews with returning soldiers and excerpts from letters sent home from Vietnam. The article ignited a political firestorm. How could American troops be sent into combat carrying defective weapons? Why had the problems not been identified and corrected before mass issue? Who had made the decisions that placed cost savings and production speed ahead of soldier survival? The pressure became impossible for Congress to ignore. On May 3, 1967, Representative Laris Mendel Rivers, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, established a special subcommittee to investigate the M16 rifle program. Representative Richard Icord of Missouri was appointed chairman, joined by Representative Speedy O. Long of Louisiana and Representative William G. Bray of Indiana. The Icord Committee would go on to conduct one of the most comprehensive investigations into a weapons procurement program in U.S. history. Over the next 5 months, the committee held hearings on May 15th, 16th, and 31st, June 21st, July 25th, 26th, and 27th, and August 8th, 9th, and 22nd. All sessions took place at the Rayburn House Office Building in Washington. Hundreds of witnesses testified, from infantrymen recently returned from Vietnam to senior Army generals, from Colt engineers and ammunition manufacturers to Pentagon procurement officials. Eugene Stoner himself appeared before the committee. All testimony was given under oath. Documents were subpoenaed. Technical experts were called to explain the ballistics, metallurgy, and mechanical design involved. The committee scrutinized every aspect of the M16 program. Procurement decisions dating back to 1963 were reviewed. Test reports that had been filed and ignored were examined. Engineering drawings and manufacturing specifications were analyzed in detail. Soldiers who had survived firefights with jammed rifles were interviewed. Weapons recovered from casualties were presented. Rifles found beside dead Americans with spent cases still fused inside their chambers. The picture that emerged was devastating. Every step that had transformed a reliable AR-15 into a failing battlefield weapon was laid bare. The substitution of IMR 4475 powder with WC 846 without adequate testing. The rejection of chrome plating despite repeated warnings. The failure to issue cleaning kits or provide maintenance training. Misleading claims that the rifle was self-cleaning. Increased cyclic rates that accelerated fouling.
quality control problems at Colt that allowed defective rifles to be shipped overseas. Each failure was supported by engineering data, internal correspondence, and the testimony of soldiers who had paid for those decisions with blood. The investigation revealed numerous warnings had been raised long before widespread deployment. Colt engineers had objected in writing to the ammunition change. Company officials stated plainly that they could not guarantee reliable performance with WC-846 powder. Eugene Stoner had specified chrome plating in his original design and reiterated its necessity during procurement. Air Force officers who had successfully fielded the rifle emphasized the importance of proper ammunition, cleaning equipment, and training. Test reports documented increased malfunction rates with ball powder. These warnings were ignored, dismissed, or buried in the rush to equip Vietnam and reduce costs. The most damaging revelations concerned what was known and when. Army Ordnance possessed data showing higher failure rates with WC-846 ammunition. They had correspondence from Colt stating performance could not be assured. They knew unplated chambers corroded rapidly in humid environments. They were aware that troops lacked proper cleaning equipment and instruction. Yet month after month, deployment continued while soldiers died with jammed rifles in their hands. The testimony of combat veterans carried the greatest weight. Marine Corporal Thomas Martinez described a firefight in which his rifle jammed after the third round. He recounted using the weapon as a club, being wounded by a bayonet, and watching his fire team leader die while trying to clear his own jammed rifle. Private First Class David Chen testified about discovering a dead American patrol. 7 men killed, all 7 M16s jammed, cleaning rods scattered among the bodies where the soldiers had died attempting to clear their weapons. When Eugene Stoner addressed the committee, he explained his original design philosophy in stark terms.
The AR-15 had been designed as an integrated system in which the rifle, its ammunition, and its maintenance requirements were meant to function as a unified whole. Altering one element without thoroughly testing the effects on the others undermined that balance. Changing the ammunition without comprehensive evaluation disrupted the system entirely. Eugene Stoner had specifically recommended chrome plating because he understood that a direct gas impingement design would be particularly susceptible to corrosion if left unprotected. At no point had he ever described the rifle as self-cleaning. That notion had originated in promotional material and was later repeated by individuals who lacked a proper understanding of the weapon's mechanics. Ballistic specialists testified in detail about the differences between the original IMR 4475 stick powder and the WC 846 ball powder that replaced it. The ball powder generated significantly higher gas port pressures, increasing the amount of gas and combustion residue forced back into the rifle's action. WC-846 also contained calcium carbonate, which produced a type of fouling not present with IMR powder. The increased gas pressure raised the cyclic rate, causing the rifle to fire more rapidly. This meant that additional rounds could be discharged before a soldier even realized a malfunction was occurring, often resulting in more severe and difficult-to-clear jams. None of this was unexpected. In fact, much of it had been anticipated in advance. Those warnings had simply gone unheeded. Representatives from Colt confirmed under oath that they had expressed concerns about the ammunition change. They testified that they had formally informed the Army they could not guarantee reliable performance with WC-846 powder, and that the resulting increase in cyclic rate exceeded Army acceptance standards.
Despite this, waivers were issued, allowing rifles to be accepted with higher-than-approved cyclic rates. Quality control inspectors also testified about discovering defects in rifles being shipped to Vietnam. Bolt carriers were found with improper heat treatment that made them prone to cracking under stress. Extractors were discovered with weak springs that lacked sufficient tension to pull stuck cartridge cases from the chamber. Inspectors rejected these weapons, but those rejections were overridden in order to maintain production schedules. Financial testimony added another troubling layer. The shift to WC-846 powder had reduced costs. Ball powder was cheaper and faster to manufacture than stick powder. Ammunition contracts proved highly profitable for Olin Matheson. The decision not to chrome plate chambers also reduced manufacturing expenses. While the committee uncovered no direct evidence of bribery or criminal corruption, it became clear that close relationships between procurement officials and defense contractors influenced decisions. Production efficiency and cost savings had been prioritized over battlefield reliability and the lives of soldiers. By August 1967, the I-Cord Committee had compiled an overwhelming body of evidence. The failures of the M16 could not be attributed solely to poor training or soldier error. They were the result of systemic breakdowns in testing, procurement, manufacturing, and deployment. Responsibility was widely shared. The Army Ordnance approved an ammunition change without sufficient testing. The Army Material Command dismissed manufacturer recommendations regarding chrome plating. Training commands failed to develop adequate maintenance instruction. Colt continued large-scale production despite being aware of reliability issues. Olin Matheson supplied ammunition incompatible with the rifle's design. Pentagon procurement officials consistently favored cost and speed over performance and safety. The committee's final report, released on October 19, 1967, laid out its conclusions and recommendations in detail. The use of ball powder ammunition was identified as the primary cause of malfunctions. The absence of chrome plating in the chamber was cited as the second major factor. The lack of proper cleaning equipment and maintenance training was listed as the third. The report called for immediate corrective measures. All M16 chambers and bores were to be chrome-plated. New ammunition with reduced fouling characteristics was to be developed. Every soldier issued an M16 was to receive a comprehensive cleaning kit. Extensive maintenance training programs were to be implemented. The rifle was to be modified to reduce its cyclic rate. Production quality control standards were to be strengthened. Most importantly, accountability was to be established for procurement decisions that directly affected soldiers' survival. The political pressure generated by the investigation made it impossible for the Army to continue along its previous path. Changes were already underway before the final report was formally published. The improved M16E1 was standardized as the M16A1. It was type classified on February 13, 1967, and officially adopted by the U.S. Army on February 28 of that year. Production of the revised rifle increased rapidly through the spring and summer. The M16A1 incorporated essential modifications that addressed each major failure point. Both the chamber and bore were chrome-plated, eliminating corrosion that had caused cartridge cases to seize. The chrome plating process required additional manufacturing steps, but it proved indispensable. Chambers were meticulously prepared, cleaned, and electroplated with a thin layer of hard chromium. This created a smooth, corrosion-resistant surface that prevented cases from sticking. Extraction failures declined sharply.
A redesigned buffer assembly was introduced to reduce the cyclic rate. This system used weighted components and springs housed in the buttstock to absorb the rearward impact of the bolt carrier. Heavier weights and stiffer springs slowed the action, bringing the cyclic rate down from well over 900 rounds per minute to a range between 750 and 850. The reduced rate resulted in smoother operation and significantly less mechanical stress. The forward assist was also improved. Although Stoner had originally opposed its inclusion, soldiers in combat found it useful when applied correctly. The revised forward assist featured a stronger pawl, capable of applying greater force to close a partially seated round. Training emphasized that the device was intended to quietly chamber a round, not to force a jammed action closed. Most critically, the rifle's redesign was accompanied by a complete overhaul of training and maintenance doctrine. The myth of the self-cleaning rifle was formally and publicly discarded. Training commands rewrote instructional materials from the ground up. The new doctrine emphasized that the M16 required frequent and thorough cleaning, especially in combat conditions. Field Manual 23-9 was entirely rewritten, providing detailed step-by-step guidance supported by photographs and diagrams. It specified precise procedures for disassembly, cleaning, lubrication, and inspection, along with required cleaning intervals. Soldiers were instructed to clean the chamber and bore after every firing session. The gas tube required weekly attention in combat environments. The bolt and bolt carrier were to be disassembled, cleaned, and lubricated daily in the field. To ensure comprehension, comic-style maintenance manuals were produced. These guides used simple illustrations, arrows, and minimal text to demonstrate each step. Even soldiers with limited literacy or limited English proficiency could follow the procedures accurately.
The issued cleaning kit finally gave soldiers the tools they had always needed. It included a sectional aluminum rod made of 3 pieces that could be screwed together to reach the entire length of the barrel. A stiff bronze bore brush was provided to scour fouling from the rifling. There was a specially designed chamber brush meant to scrub the chamber walls where cartridge cases had previously seized. Pipe cleaners were included to allow soldiers to clean the gas tube without taking the rifle apart. Cotton patches were used to wipe metal surfaces clean, and a small bottle of lubricant ensured proper operation. A toothbrush-style brush allowed detailed cleaning of the bolt and bolt carrier. Everything fit into a compact plastic case that could be carried in a cargo pocket or attached to load-bearing gear without inconvenience. Weapon maintenance was no longer optional. Soldiers were expected to clean their rifles every day while in combat, and more frequently after heavy firing. Squad leaders conducted regular inspections, and platoon sergeants performed thorough checks before and after operations. A neglected rifle was treated as a serious lapse in discipline, on par with other major violations. The message was unmistakable. A properly maintained rifle would function. A neglected one would fail. Training programs emphasized correct cleaning techniques and enforced strict inspections. Recruits spent countless hours learning how to break down, clean, and reassemble their rifles until they could do so quickly, accurately, and even in complete darkness. Before deploying to Southeast Asia, troops received additional instruction focused specifically on maintaining weapons in hot, humid, tropical environments where corrosion and fouling occurred rapidly. The most critical improvement came with changes to the ammunition itself. In 1970, WC-844 powder replaced WC-846 in 5.56 mm cartridges. The new powder contained significantly less calcium carbonate, dramatically reducing fouling inside the rifle. When combined with chrome-plated chambers and bores, the extraction failures that had previously crippled the weapon were effectively eliminated. The impact was immediate and unmistakable. By late 1967 and early 1968, units equipped with M16A1 rifles, proper cleaning kits, and adequate training reported dramatic improvements in performance. Malfunction rates dropped to levels equal to or better than other standard-issue military rifles. The catastrophic extraction failures that had cost so many lives nearly disappeared. Soldiers who had once distrusted and even despised the rifle began to rely on it. With reliability restored, the rifle's strengths finally became apparent. Its light weight allowed troops to carry more ammunition or reduce the physical strain of long patrols. The 30-round magazine provided sustained firepower during engagements. The rifle's controllability in automatic fire enabled effective suppressive fire. The high-velocity 5.56mm round delivered devastating terminal effects at jungle combat distances. With proper ammunition, chrome-plated chambers, and disciplined maintenance, the M16A1 became what it was always intended to be. In early 1968, the Army conducted extensive surveys among troops in Vietnam to evaluate confidence in the improved rifle and identify any lingering concerns. The results were overwhelmingly positive. Approval ratings varied slightly depending on question wording, but consistently ranged between 85% and 98%. A detailed Department of Defense survey conducted in February 1968 questioned 2,100 soldiers and Marines about their combat experience with the M16A1. Only 38 respondents, fewer than 2%, expressed a desire to replace the rifle with another weapon. A vast majority reported reliable performance in combat. Most troops indicated they had experienced no significant malfunctions in the previous month of operations. When problems did occur, they were usually minor feeding issues that could be cleared quickly, rather than the severe extraction jams that had previously rendered rifles useless. A survey conducted between August and September 1967, while improvements were still being introduced, showed that 85% of respondents believed the M16 performed well in combat, and 87% stated they liked the weapon. Another survey, conducted between January and February 1968, found that 85% of troops preferred the M16 or the XM77 carbine for combat use. The remaining percentage favored other weapons, a level of variation considered normal for any military firearm. The transformation was complete. A rifle once described as a death trap, refused by soldiers and cursed in battle, became trusted and effective. The same fundamental design, when properly implemented with suitable ammunition, corrosion protection, cleaning equipment, and training, proved to be an excellent combat weapon. The human cost of the delay, however, could never be calculated. No precise figure exists for how many American soldiers died because their rifles failed during combat, but the number was undoubtedly in the hundreds and possibly higher. Every one of those deaths was preventable. Each was the result of decisions made far from the battlefield by individuals who prioritized cost savings and production speed over the lives of soldiers. Beyond fatalities, thousands more were wounded while fighting with jammed rifles or resorting to inferior weapons. The psychological damage was just as profound. Soldiers lost confidence not only in their equipment, but in the institution that had sent them into combat with defective weapons. The scandal extended beyond individual suffering.
The M16 controversy became emblematic of broader failures in the Vietnam War. Rushed decisions, insufficient testing, bureaucratic priorities outweighing human realities, and a growing divide between leadership and those fighting on the ground. For many Americans, the image of soldiers dying with jammed rifles became a powerful symbol of the war's deeper problems. The story did not end in 1967. The M16A1 served effectively for the remainder of the conflict, growing more reliable as training improved and familiarity increased. Veterans who had once condemned the early rifles later praised the corrected version. The design continued to evolve through the M16A2, A3, A4, and eventually the M4 carbine, serving U.S. forces for more than half a century and being adopted by militaries around the world. That transformation occurred because the failures were exposed, investigated publicly, and corrected methodically. The legacy of the M16 crisis reshaped military procurement practices for decades. The ICORD Committee's investigation established enduring standards for congressional oversight of weapons programs. Prior to the scandal, arms procurement had largely remained an internal military affair, with Congress funding programs but rarely questioning technical decisions. The M16 controversy changed that relationship permanently, ensuring that future weapon systems would face far greater scrutiny before being placed in the hands of soldiers whose lives depended on them.
The ICORD investigation permanently altered how the American military approached weapons development and procurement. One of its most profound effects was the elevation of soldier experience from an afterthought to a core element of evaluation. Before Vietnam, weapons were primarily assessed by ordnance officers, engineers, and laboratory technicians. Decisions were based on controlled tests, technical metrics, and theoretical performance. The perspectives of the soldiers who would actually carry these weapons into combat were seldom requested, and, when offered, were often brushed aside as subjective or unscientific. The M16 crisis exposed the flaw in that thinking. Soldiers fighting in real combat environments encountered failures and limitations that no laboratory test could fully replicate. Their observations were not complaints born of frustration, but critical operational intelligence. Combat conditions revealed truths that controlled environments concealed. The Army was forced to acknowledge that the soldier in the field was often the first and best source of information about whether a weapon truly worked. In response, formal channels were created to capture and act on this feedback. After the war, the Army established the Product Quality Deficiency Report System, allowing service members to submit official reports detailing equipment failures or shortcomings. These reports were logged, tracked, and investigated, with the potential to trigger engineering revisions or changes in procurement policy. Similar systems were adopted across the other branches of the armed forces. For the first time, the voice of the individual soldier carried. The ICORD investigation permanently altered how the American military approached weapons development and procurement. One of its most profound effects was the elevation of soldier experience from an afterthought to a core element of evaluation. Before Vietnam, weapons were primarily assessed by ordnance officers, engineers, and laboratory technicians. Decisions were based on controlled tests, technical metrics, and theoretical performance. The perspectives of the soldiers who would actually carry these weapons into combat were seldom requested, and, when offered, were often brushed aside as subjective or unscientific. The M16 crisis exposed the flaw in that thinking. Soldiers fighting in real combat environments encountered failures and limitations that no laboratory test could fully replicate. Their observations were not complaints born of frustration, but critical operational intelligence. Combat conditions revealed truths that controlled environments concealed. The army was forced to acknowledge that the soldier in the field was often the first and best source of information about whether a weapon truly worked. In response, formal channels were created to capture and act on this feedback. After the war, the Army established the Product Quality Deficiency Report System, allowing service members to submit official reports detailing equipment failures or shortcomings. These reports were logged, tracked, and investigated, with the potential to trigger engineering revisions or changes in procurement policy. Similar systems were adopted across the other branches of the armed forces. For the first time, the voice of the individual soldier carried institutional authority. Operational testing in realistic combat conditions also became mandatory before widespread adoption of new weapons. The era of fielding rifles based solely on laboratory trials and limited demonstrations ended. New small arms were required to undergo extensive testing by active combat units under conditions that mirrored real-world use. Units provided detailed evaluations covering reliability, ease of maintenance, durability, and battlefield effectiveness. No major procurement decision could move forward without favorable operational test results. Procurement rules were tightened to prevent the shortcuts and exceptions that had contributed to the M16 disaster. Waivers that allowed weapons to be accepted despite failing to meet specifications were no longer casually approved. Any deviation from established standards now required detailed justification, formal documentation, and approval at senior levels. The routine granting of waivers that had permitted flawed rifles to be shipped to Vietnam became far more difficult. Quality control procedures were overhauled. Previously, contractors often handled their own inspections with limited external oversight. After the scandal, government inspectors were granted expanded authority to reject defective weapons, even if manufacturers deemed them acceptable. Overruling inspector rejections to meet production quotas was explicitly prohibited. Defects were no longer something to be worked around, they had to be fixed. Above all, the investigation reinforced a fundamental principle that still governs military procurement today. A weapon is a system. The rifle, the ammunition, the maintenance procedures, and the training all interact. Altering one element affects the entire system. Cost reductions that undermine reliability are not savings when measured against human lives. Manufacturer warnings should be treated as expertise, not obstacles. Complaints from soldiers in combat must be addressed immediately, not buried under layers of bureaucracy. In 1985, 2 decades after the Battle of Ya Drang, veterans of the 1st Cavalry Division gathered for a reunion in Texas. Many brought their families, hoping to share a part of their history. Among those present were men who had carried the first M16s into battle in 1965, and others who had fought later with rifles plagued by malfunctions. Former Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, who served in Vietnam from 1967 to 1968, reflected on the experience. He described the early M16 bluntly, saying it was a lethal liability. Everyone knew it was failing. Soldiers reported the problems again and again, but nothing changed for nearly a year. Men were killed while officials debated powder formulas and the cost of chrome plating. Then, he said, the M16A1 arrived. Once corrected, it was a fundamentally different weapon. Light, accurate, and dependable when properly maintained, it became the best rifle he had ever carried. It finally matched what the original design had promised. The lessons drawn from that failure extended far beyond a single rifle. Independent testing by combat troops became standard practice. Congressional oversight of major weapons programs became routine rather than exceptional. Contractor claims were verified rather than accepted at face value. Although the M16 is now gradually being replaced by newer systems, its descendants will remain in service for years. What nearly became the most infamous procurement failure in American history instead evolved into one of its most successful weapon families, precisely because the failure was exposed rather than concealed. The M16 crisis revealed enduring truths about warfare and procurement. Reliability cannot be rushed. Soldier feedback must be taken seriously and acted upon without delay. Transparency and accountability are essential for improvement. Even excellent designs can be rendered deadly by poor implementation, and failures, when confronted honestly, can be corrected. The soldiers who died because their rifles jammed deserved far better. They deserved weapons that had been fully tested as complete systems. They deserved ammunition that functioned correctly. They deserved chambers that would not corrode in tropical climates. They deserved cleaning equipment, proper training, and leaders who listened and responded. That later generations received these improvements doesn't lessen the loss of those who did not. The M16 story became one of redemption because a rifle once cursed as a death trap became within a few years a trusted tool of war. A symbol of bureaucratic failure was transformed into evidence that accountability could force reform. But redemption never erases responsibility. The price of that transformation was paid by men who died holding jammed rifles. It took public exposure, media scrutiny, and congressional investigation to force action when the military bureaucracy hesitated. The Ickard Committee saved lives by uncovering the truth and demanding change. Today's soldiers carry reliable weapons because earlier soldiers were forced to fight with unreliable ones, and because those failures were not hidden. The rifle jammed. Soldiers died. The truth reached the public. Congress intervened, corrections were made, the rifle worked. That sequence defines both the tragedy and the triumph of the M16. The men who served during the worst years, particularly in 1966 and 1967, deserve recognition not only for their combat service, but for their perseverance with defective equipment. They adapted, fought on, used grenades, captured enemy weapons, and sheer determination to survive. They reported failures, wrote letters home, and refused to stay silent. The M16 failed American soldiers in Vietnam. Then America fixed the M16. That painful progression of failure and correction reshaped military procurement for generations. The tragedy was avoidable. The improvement was hard-won. Together, they left lessons written in blood, lessons that continue to protect soldiers today.